You haven't eaten in 2 days, but you know exactly where the herd is. You spent all of yesterday tracking it, you've got the entire route mapped out in your head, and now all you literally have to do is get there. And then it starts raining. And I don't mean a light drizzle. We're talking a heavy, soaking, wind-driven downpour that just does not stop. It goes all day and then all night. You can't hunt, you can't track, and honestly, trying to move across rocky terrain in bare feet, that's a guaranteed twisted ankle. And out here, a twisted ankle basically means death. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating question. What exactly did ancient humans do when it just rained all week? Well, as we're about to see, how our ancestors handled this forced downtime is actually a huge part of why ancient humans stayed alive and why we're here today. Think about it. Today, when it rains, what do? We close the window, grab a warm blanket, curl up on the couch, and fire up Netflix, right? It's just cozy background noise. But for a human being living, say, 50,000 years ago, that exact same sound you're falling asleep to was a full-blown crisis. It wasn't just annoying, it was completely deadly. A big rainstorm could literally kill you in 3 entirely different ways before the clouds even broke. Okay, let's break down those 3 immediate threats. First up, cold. You know, a wet human loses body heat something like 25 times faster than a dry one. So without waterproof gear, a long storm in anything below 50 degrees Fahrenheit is going to drop your core temperature straight into hypothermia in just a few hours. Second threat, floods. A lot of these caves and rock shelters were situated right at the base of hillsides. In fact, archaeologists have found thick layers of flood sediment inside these occupied caves, which basically means flash floods were sweeping right through their living rooms. And then there's step 3, which is probably the most terrifying, predators. Because guess what? Rain drove wild animals indoors too, and sometimes they decided they wanted the exact same cave you were hiding in. To give you an idea of just how intense that predator threat was, get this. In South African cave sites, archaeologists have actually dug up human remains alongside large cat remains, completely buried in the exact same geological layers. And terrifyingly, some of those human skulls have puncture marks that perfectly match leopard teeth. The rain essentially compressed the entire world. It squeezed humans, predators, and prey right into the same small, dry spaces, all at the exact same time. So, in the middle of all that absolute chaos, you had one job that mattered above everything else: keeping the fire alive. Now, we have evidence of early controlled fire going back 1 million years at Wonderwork Cave and about 400,000 years ago at Kesem Cave. But here's the terrifying reality of the ancient world. Controlling a fire that's already burning and creating a brand new one from scratch are 2 entirely different skill sets. For most of human history, if your fire went out during a rainstorm, well, you couldn't just magically snap your fingers and relight it. Since starting a fire from scratch was so incredibly brutal, early humans had to get super resourceful. A lot of times, they'd actually have to carry an ember from a previous fire using something called tinder fungus. It's basically this woody mushroom that acts like a biological lighter. It can catch a spark and just safely smolder inside itself for hours on end. So, during a massive storm, one person's entire job would be shielding that fire, feeding it dry lower branches, and using stuff like birch bark as kindling. Birch bark is actually amazing for this because it contains a chemical called butylene, which lets it burn even when it's completely soaking wet. And just to prove how absolutely critical this fire preservation was, let's look at the year 5300. That's 5,300 years ago, which honestly is pretty recent in the grand scheme of things. But when they found Otzi the Iceman, you know, the famous frozen guy preserved in the Alps, he was carrying a complete, highly dedicated fire kit right in his belt pouch. He had his tinder fungus, flint, iron pyrite for striking sparks, and backup plant tinder. Even just 5,300 years ago, losing your fire was a literal matter of life and death. All right, so let's set the scene. You've protected the fire, you're mostly dry, the leopards are hopefully keeping their distance, but the rain is still absolutely hammering outside and there is no way you can leave. So what do? Well, you definitely don't just sit there twiddling your thumbs. As the archaeological record shows us time and time again, you manufacture. This forced downtime is exactly what turned our ancient ancestors from simply being hunters into absolute master craftsmen. It's genuinely fascinating to look at the sheer explosion of ancient technology that was created indoors. Take Blombo's cave 100,000 years ago. Someone set up an entire ochre processing workshop in there, using abalone shells as little mixing bowls. Or in South Africa, 61,000 years ago, we find these incredibly delicate, precise bone needles with tiny drilled eyes. I mean, you definitely don't carve a tiny bone needle while you're running from a predator, right? You make it when you have hours to just sit perfectly still. And over at Sibudu Cave, 77,000 years ago, they were making these comfortable beds out of Cape laurel leaves. Those leaves act as a natural insect repellent. They were literally inventing pest control just waiting out the rain. And the technology gets even more sophisticated. Think about something as simple as string. Over at Aubry Demara's in France, researchers found a tiny fragment of twisted plant fiber string that dates back 52,000 years. And it gets crazier. At Hohlefels Cave in Germany, they uncovered a 35,000-year-old tool carved out of mammoth ivory. It has these 4 holes and spiral grooves in it. It was basically a dedicated rope-making machine. Making rope is incredibly slow, tedious, repetitive work. It takes immense patience. In other words, it is the absolute perfect bad weather task. Now here is the absolutely crucial point. That slow, boring, rainy day task fundamentally revolutionized human survival. Once early humans had rope, everything changed. Suddenly they could tie things together, they could construct much stronger weatherproof shelters, they could engineer complex snares and traps to catch food passively, and they could securely bind their stone tools to wooden handles. Think about it, a massive chunk of all human technology literally runs on string, and it was almost certainly perfected by someone stuck inside a cave just waiting for the weather to clear up. But this forced downtime didn't just give us practical tools. It built into something much more profound, the birth of human culture. Let's look at Chauvet Cave, roughly 36,000 years ago. Humans there created these astonishing, masterful paintings of lions, horses, and rhinos. But here's the catch. They didn't paint them at the cave entrance where the natural light was. No. They crawled hundreds of meters deep underground, squeezing through incredibly narrow, pitch-black passages, carrying little animal fat lamps. You don't do something like that when the weather is gorgeous and the hunting is good. You do that when you've already sharpened every tool you own, it's still pouring rain outside, and you just have this overwhelming human urge to create.
The rain didn't just foster art either. It quite literally shaped how we connect with one another. There's this incredible study by Anthropology Polly Weissner on the Jew Huansi Bushmen. She found that during the day, their conversations were almost entirely about practical stuff, gathering resources, land rights, everyday complaints. But at nighttime, gathered around the fire, a full 80% of the talking shifted to stories, songs, and ceremonies. Being forced together around a fire in a confined space just softens faces, it reduces tension, and it creates this entirely different, bonded environment for sharing.
I absolutely love this quote because it perfectly captures the magic of that shift. The campfire wasn't just warmth, it was the original social network. That's critical knowledge being passed from one brain to another. When our ancestors sat out a week-long storm, they weren't just making idle small talk. They were telling stories that contained highly critical survival data. Things like where the water sources dry up in the summer, exactly which plants are safe to eat, and how to track very specific predators.
And if you doubt the sheer staying power of fireside storytelling, let this number sink in for a second. 7,000. The oldest known oral traditions that have actually been scientifically verified against real, physical geological events are Australian Aboriginal stories describing ancient sea level changes. Those stories survived for 7,000 years. And how? Purely through human beings telling them to each other over and over again. That level of deep cultural memory only develops when groups spend enormous amounts of time sitting together in forced downtime.
Section 2. The Aftermath Advantage, when the storm finally breaks. Because here's the part of the story that often gets entirely overlooked. Rain wasn't always just a miserable crisis that you had to white-knuckle your way through. Sometimes, stepping out of that cave after a massive storm was the single greatest strategic advantage an ancient human could ask for. When they finally walked back outside, the whole world had transformed in their favor. The ground was now soft mud, meaning animal tracks were deep, clear, and perfectly detailed. Every little rock depression near the campsite was suddenly filled to the brim with clean, fresh drinking water. Plant life, mushrooms, and tubers just exploded in growth, making them so much easier to pull up from the wet, loose soil. And incredibly, in places like tropical Africa, these highly protein-dense termites would swarm by the thousands right after a storm. You didn't even need weapons or traps to hunt them. You could literally just pick them up. The rain didn't stop the food supply, it completely changed it, and it heavily rewarded the humans who were ready to capitalize on it. Which brings us right to the core of why ancient humans stayed alive. They survived because of downtime. Every single tool they meticulously crafted, every piece of warm clothing they sewed together, every rope they twisted, and every vital survival story they passed down to their kids, all of it came from the hours and days when they physically couldn't go outside. When your very survival depends entirely on what you can make with your own two hands in the next few hours, you don't get bored. You get fiercely, beautifully creative.
So I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. We live in an era today where the exact second we have even 5 seconds of downtime, we immediately pull out a glowing screen. We have completely banished boredom from our modern lives. But if forced downtime, literally just sitting around a fire with nothing to do but think and connect with others, is the very engine of human ingenuity and our survival, what exactly are we losing by never allowing ourselves to just be bored today? Definitely something to think about the next time you're stuck inside on a rainy afternoon. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will catch you on the next one.